Good afternoon and welcome to MEI's newly renovated headquarters. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's important and timely panel examining CENTCOM's approach to the Middle East. Today's event gives us the opportunity to reflect on the by, with, and through approach and explore prospects for an effective U.S. military role in the region, especially given current news from northeast Syria. We have a great panel of experts to discuss this with you today. Ken Pollack, Dana Stroul, and we're also pleased to welcome back MEI Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense and Security Program, Bilal Saab, after a one-year fellowship at the Department of Defense. We're happy to have him back and look forward to hearing his insights from his upcoming article in the 2019 fall issue of the Washington Quarterly entitled Broken Partnerships, Can Washington Get Security Cooperation Right? Moderating today's panel of distinguished experts is Eric Schmitt. Eric is a senior writer covering terrorism and national security for the New York Times. Since 2007, he has reported on terrorism issues with assignments to Pakistan, Afghanistan, North Africa, Southeast Asia, among others. He is the co-author of Counterstrike, The Untold Story of America's Secret Campaign Against Al-Qaeda, published in 2011. Before joining the Times, Eric was an education reporter at the Tri-City Herald in Kennewick, Washington. He's come a long way, from September 1982 until September 1983. Eric will introduce the other distinguished members of today's panel, but before he begins, I would like to remind you to silence your mobile devices. The broadcast or the panel discussion today is being covered by C-SPAN 2, Fox, and CNN, but we do welcome you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag MEISecurity. With that, I will turn over to Eric Schmitt.
Thanks, Jerry, and thank you all for coming today. Just wanted to briefly introduce our panelists today before we get into our discussion. Kind of starting on the far left, Dana Stroul is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. She previously served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she covered the Middle East. On her right, General Joseph Votel, distinguished fellow MEI. Most of you probably know him as the former commander of Central Command and Special Operations Command. On General Votel's right, Ken Pollack is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He served at the CIA and had stints in the National Security Council under President Bill Clinton. He covered the Middle East, and in particular Iran and Iraq. And finally, on my left, Bilal Saab, as Jerry said, is a senior fellow and director of the Defense and Security Program here at MEI, and previously served as a senior advisor for security cooperation, the Pentagon's Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, with responsibilities for CENTCOM. So what we're going to do today is have a discussion. We're going to start out with each of the speakers. We'll talk for about 10 minutes. I'll ask each of them a question or two, and then we'll throw it open to you all for a discussion toward the end of this. But right now, I think we're going to start with Ken to give us kind of a kickoff where we stand on this.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank all of you. It's wonderful to be with my distinguished colleagues up here. It's nice to be back at MEI, but in this fabulous new building. Thank you, B. So I guess there are obviously a lot of different dimensions to this problem. My job is to start out by talking about, I think, the substantive issue that's really at the kind of the root of everything. And it's an issue that's well known to everyone in this room, but it's one we don't like to talk about a whole lot. I do, but most people don't. And that is the fundamental problem that our Arab allies do not have the capacity to defend themselves against their primary threats, right? That's where it all starts for us. And that's been driven home in recent weeks and in recent months and in recent years by any number of developments across the Middle East. I think the vast majority of Americans would love it if our Arab allies were better able to defend themselves, either so that we could leave the region altogether, or for those who recognize that there may be reasons we would need to stay or would want to stay anyway, at the very least so that they could do more for themselves and we didn't have to do so much for them. Now, there are a lot of different reasons why this is a problem. I talk about them in my new book, Armies of Sand, something I discussed figuratively in this space a number of months ago. I'm not going to go into the full description here. That's not the point here. Simply to say that the reasons that Arab militaries have had such difficulty with conventional military operations over the last 70 years, why they continue to have such difficulty today, and why they're likely to in the near future, is rooted in some very large problems that are not going to be easily or quickly fixed. They're rooted in the politics, the economics, the culture, the educational practices of the Arab world. Right? None of that is going to be changed very quickly. Right? But that doesn't mean that the Arab militaries are hopeless. And I think that one of the important things to think about when we think about this new concept of by, with, and through is that it's both a virtue and a necessity. Right? The truth is that we might not have wanted to fight this way. I know that when our military commanders were first confronted with the problem of Daesh, of ISIS, coming back into Iraq and taking over so much territory in Syria, it isn't necessarily the way that they would have liked to have fought that war if they could have had their druthers. But they didn't have a choice. That was what was available to them. And they made a virtue out of necessity. And I think that there are some important things to take away from it, things that are actually valuable to think about in their own right. Because the truth of the matter is that while Arab militaries do have tremendous difficulty with modern conventional warfare, they're not hapless. There are things that can be done. There are workarounds. There are ways to tailor those forces. There are ways to approach military operations that have allowed them greater success in the past. And what the by, with, and through approach did was it forced our commanders, particularly my friend Sean McFarland, who really was wrestling with this in 2015 in Iraq, and I think was really the guy who kind of figured out how to do this and set the stage, created the model that we're using elsewhere. And he realized some things that are true for Arab militaries across the board and have been for the last 70 years. When they form small elite forces, they tend to do better. When you can create a kind of a military subculture, the way that the Jordanians did back in the 30s and 40s, the way that I would argue the UAE is doing today, that also stands them in good stead. When they can rely on someone else's firepower and act as an adjunct to it, they can do better. When they can do static operations, set-piece operations, they can do better. Right? There are ways to do this that can take advantage of some of the skills that are there in Arab militaries. And as I said, I think that by necessity, having to do by, with, and through, the fact that we had a leadership back here that did not want to simply put an American heavy division down in the middle of the Jazeera Desert and wipe out Daesh by itself, which was something that plenty of people were talking about at the time. I think many in the military would have loved to have been able to do that because at the kind of substantive level, that was the easy answer, right? That would have been a way to defeat ISIS, destroy it really quickly and really easily, but it wasn't politically possible. And so instead, they had to adopt the by, with, and through method. They had to go to the Iraqis and secondarily to the Syrians and say, okay, we can't do it for you. You guys are going to have to do it yourself. We can provide you with a great deal of assistance, but at the end of the day, it's going to be Iraqi and Syrian combat troops who are going to need to take the fight. And we've got to figure out ways to train up more effective Iraqi and Syrian forces and provide them with the combat enablers that are going to make them successful and put them in situations where they can be successful. Right? That's the heart of by, with, and through. And as I said, that was a necessity born of the political restrictions placed on those people trying to implement the mission. But I actually think that it does speak to these deeper truths, that there are better ways to do this, right? That there are ways to think about how we train, how we help train our Arab allies that will allow them to do better than they have done in the past, right? And it starts from a recognition that those armies aren't like our own. Right? Again, this is something I talk about at great length in my book, and when I'm going to say it, it's going to sound really obvious. But the truth is we haven't really respected it for the last 70 years, which is that the average Arab, let's say 18-year-old boy, really isn't like the average American 18-year-old boy or girl, right? And trying to train an Arab boy the way that you would train an American boy or girl, it's not going to work, right? It just isn't. They aren't the same as us. They don't come from the same society. They don't think about things the same ways that we do. They have different strengths and weaknesses, right? And of course, our insistence, it's not just us. The Russians did the same thing. The British did the same thing. The French do the same thing. We all assume that our system is simply right, and it's right for everyone. Right? And when you go in there and try to train someone on a system that isn't properly devised, properly adapted for their society, it doesn't work well. And what we find all around the world is that the militaries that do best are the ones who take someone else's system or build their own, right? When they take someone else's system, they adapt it to their own society, to their own circumstances. And again, by, with, and through forced us to do the same exact thing for the Iraqis and to a lesser extent for the Syrian opposition. Now, moving forward, that does set up at least a temporary model for how we move forward until you can have deeper, larger societal change. Societal change, which I think everyone in this room knows that all of the Arab leaders would like to see happen, although they're very nervous about actually trying to implement it. But until we can get to that longer term, there are absolutely things that can be done. But the big issues there bring us back to politics, both here and in the Arab world. Right? Because it requires going to the Arab leaders and saying, we're not going to give you the same training that we give to American troops. Because honestly, it's not right for your forces. Instead, we're going to tailor something else that is right for your forces. And that's very hard for leaders who want the best and believe that whatever the Americans give their own troops has got to be the best, so I want the best, so I want that. And it's also hard back here in Washington, because when they pay us to give them the best training, by God, we're going to give them the best training, and that's how we train our own troops, right? And so those political battles, they're a big part of getting us to the point where we can deal with these other set of issues. And with that, let me turn it over to General Votel. Maybe he can straighten out the 30,000-foot level for all of us.
Yeah, Ken, before we do that, but let me just ask you about Iraq.
Sure.
We've had a lot of uptick in violence there just in the last week or so. And wanted to get if you can be more specific when you talk about this model that's been developed, what are the 2 or 3 takeaways that you think have been learned successfully and maybe haven't been learned successfully given the amount of time U.S. military has spent in Iraq over the last 2 decades?
Sure, that's a great question, Eric. So in terms of the kind of the key takeaways I think that we have learned, or at least parts of the United States have learned. It's not clear that the whole U.S. government has learned it. Again, I think that there are things that we hit upon during the course of by, with, and through. So recognizing that the Iraqi CTS, right, a small elite force of picked soldiers, really could evince some degree of combat capability, right? These were guys who had a certain amount of unit cohesion, were able to advance against fire, could do some very, very basic fire and maneuver, but enough so that they could clear a foe that was tough but not superhuman, under circumstances with a lot of American support, right? That was very important, recognizing that CTS was critical. Recognizing that we had to rebuild the Iraqi command structure, right? We had, during the surge, had built more or less a new Iraqi military command. Nouri al-Maliki had then destroyed it. After we pulled out in 2011, we had to go back and rebuild it to create the political and command and control circumstances to do what we needed to do. Giving the Iraqis ownership of it, letting them feel like they were the ones responsible, giving them that sense of pride, building up a sense of national self-esteem was also a very important one. And then there is also this issue of kind of the picking out the right missions, right? Not putting these guys in positions where, yeah, they had to do kind of big, free-flowing, unscripted maneuver battles, right? That's not what even the Iraqi CTS is capable of doing. But you put them in the right circumstances, set-piece operations, limited offensives, lots of American enablers, they really could do fine. right? And those are things we want to take away that, again, I think the U.S. military certainly recognizes that is the way forward. That's the model for other militaries, and we need to figure out how we help other militaries get to that. The thing that we didn't learn, well, that's obvious, right? That the military piece of any of these wars is about 10% of actually solving them. That the other 90% is the political, the diplomatic, the economic, which we once again have blithely ignored, and once again Iraq is teetering on the brink of yet another conflict as a result.
That's great. And I wanted to use that to kind of pivot to General Votel, because, General, I think the American public has kind of gotten a crash course this week in by, with, and through in Syria, in northeastern Syria, an area you know quite well, and obviously with the Turkish offensive that's carried out, just started yesterday after President Trump, seemingly greenlit this operation after a phone call on Sunday with President Erdogan. You were quite critical in an op-ed you wrote yesterday in the Atlantic. Tell us a little bit more about your experience from this and
Sure. Thanks,
what you
Eric.
draw from this
And,
as
thanks.
recent command.
It's great to be here, Ken. Thanks for that great setup. Let me start big, and then we'll kind of get to the area that Eric just talked about. In the current National Defense Strategy released back in 2018, it really articulated that our principal priority was maintaining competitive advantage against great powers. It also, a key precept within that, however, was the importance of partnership, especially in those areas where we will have to exercise an economy of U.S. military resources or presence on the ground. And there's a very strong belief, I currently subscribe to this, or I have always subscribed to this, that strong partnership can act as a mitigator, in fact, in these areas where we choose to accept some risk, but where we also retain important national security interests. So what I'm trying to convey to you here is that partnership is a part of our overall approach. And we have had a lot of tools in the past to deal with this. We have things like security force assistance. This is kind of unified action across our government to help a country develop their own security apparatus to answer to their people and to their government. You can think of this as any one of our very well-established security cooperation offices out there that work in conjunction with country teams and with combatant commands to kind of address the security requirements of our partners out there. In the special operations world, particularly in the SF world, special forces, we've had things like foreign internal defense, and of course these are specific military activities that support a friendly government against an internal threat. And there's a variety of different examples around here. In my experience, I would think we actually tried to do this in Yemen in 2011, 2013, when we were assisting the government of Yemen deal with Al-Qaeda, who was actually trying to control ground down in the southern part of the country, and we worked with them to address that specific threat. And still, there's other things like unconventional warfare. Again, a little bit of a confusing term here, but an important concept, and it's really the opposite approach here. That is where we actually support a resistance movement or an insurgency against an occupying adversary government. There's a number of examples of this. I think perhaps one of the best ones is our support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion. And I would say that our operations in Afghanistan right after 2001 had this flavor, especially in the north, where we had special forces teams working very closely with the Northern Alliance to accomplish military objectives against the seemingly Taliban government that was in place. But complementing this approach, as we've kind of talked about, is this idea of by, with, and through. And I think what by, with, and through represents, it's kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's how we actually implement some of these ideas on the ground. And I think it's important, and we talked a lot about this in my time at CENTCOM and trying to define a little bit what by, with, and through actually means. Each of those words, kind of sounds the same, but they really, in my mind, mean something different. By, of course, implies that these are activities conducted largely by our partners on the ground, whether they're state forces or whether they're indigenous partners. With means with our enabling capabilities and advice. that we are bringing something to them to help them moving forward with this. And then through, I think through refers to this idea of authorities, approvals, agreements, expectations that are established. One of the things that we were able to do with the Syrian Democratic Forces as we work with them over a number of months and, in fact, years, was really establish red lines, things that we were not going to support. We were not going to support any efforts to unite the Kurdish cantons. We were not going to go to Afrin after the Turkish incursion there. And so these are the types of expectations that I'm kind of talking about, that form kind of the background of how this approach actually plays out on the ground. There are some disadvantages to this approach, and I think it's important to recognize what that is. And partners set the pace in this. That could be an advantage, but in most cases, we are going to be beholden to the pace at which they are doing things. And they may not be moving as fast or as directly as we want to, and so they're going to set the pace. They may not do things the same way that we would do, and I don't mean ethically or legally. That's an imperative up front, operating in accordance with the rule of law and the law of armed conflict. That's very clear up front, and that's kind of one of those expectations through which we are providing this support. But, as the deeper we got into the Euphrates Valley over the last 5 or 6 months of the campaign, the more we saw the Syrian Democratic Forces, and particularly the Arab elements, stopping operations, trying to negotiate, so to speak, with ISIS to minimize the impact on their villages, minimize impact on civilians. I don't think anybody can certainly argue with that, but we were obviously very, very concerned about how we maintain the momentum against this force. We didn't want to let them get away to fight another day in terms of this. So, they will not do things the way that we always do. And I think we own the strategic risk with this. Certainly in this, as we've just seen this week, we've always known that there was a risk in our approach with Turkey. And that is a risk that we have owned with this approach. But there are some advantages to it, and Ken touched on a couple of them. It minimizes our footprint and it minimizes our operational risk, our tactical operational risk. You've seen a number of things this week about the number of casualties the Syrian Democratic Forces absorbed versus what the coalition did. Again, all casualties are horrific. No doubt about it. But I think you get my point here, that when you can minimize your footprint, minimize your operational risk, there is a certain political advantage to that as we pursue this. Another advantage is the partners own the outcome in this thing. One of the most prolific pictures, and I use it in a lot of the presentations and discussions I do, is the picture of the Iraqi leadership in Mosul after the completion of operations up there. It's quite poignant, and it's all Iraqis from all the different flavors of their forces surrounding the prime minister and other members of the government, raising their own flag and praising their own people for this. This is a really important aspect of this, of them owning this afterwards. As we completed operations in Syria, what we often saw was our local partners beginning to set up local security and local governance. This is an incredibly important aspect. We can advise on that, but when they're doing this, they actually own it. And this can be effective without this institution building aspect of partnership. We did not try to reorganize the Syrian, the YPG or the Arab militias that ultimately made up the Syrian Democratic Forces. We took them as they were. Now in Iraq, we had to do a little bit of rebuilding of the army back in the beginning there. Sean McFarland, when his predecessors or his successors were very key to this, and that was an important step that we had to take. But once that's accomplished and underway, then we're not really focused on the institution of it. We're really focused on helping them be successful. So let me just talk just a little bit more about the Syrian Democratic Forces, because I think that's a pertinent and relevant example here, and to talk a little bit about it in some detail. So how this started, it started with YPG literally pushed up against the border because of ISIS and trying to fight literally to save their lives in the town of Kobani. And we became aware of this through some of our other contacts in the region and through authorities and discussion that took place. And there was significant discussion in our national security process throughout all of this. We made the determination that we would provide some level of fire support to help them, help protect them, help them break out of this. And what we saw was they were very successful at this. They made very good use of this. And it really drew on the innovativeness of our people to figure out ways to communicate with them, non-traditional ways, not highly technical from our standpoint, but leveraging the internet, leveraging applications, leveraging cell phones, all those type of things to do that. And we saw success with that. And we saw them begin to break out. Then we had some discussions about maybe we should put people on the ground with them to see if we can enhance their success as we move through, and we did. Then we began to expand our touch even more with them in terms of this. And again, the whole time this is taking place, there are discussions at the National Security Council level and authorities and approvals being passed down to us to do these things. Along the way, we added in a train-the-trainer capacity so that as they brought forces, they recruited, they brought people into the force, they had a mechanism to bring them up to a level. We added equipment provision in here. Again, significant policy discussions associated with it. We started with the Arab component of it and eventually came to realize that we also had to give some limited equipping to the Kurdish portions of this, of the organization, because they essentially were the backbone. They did a lot of the difficult fighting, and it became very important in places like Raqqa and other places where we were fighting. And then along the way, we expanded our enablers. We started out with just ISR and drones, but eventually we had artillery, we had attack helicopters, a variety of other enablers brought on the ground to do this, that we were able to expand it out. And then, of course, we started integrating other elements of our power. The very small USAID START teams are on the ground. I refer to this as the Magnificent Seven. 7 people, that's all it was. They were great. And they moved in conjunction with us, and they did a lot of great work complementing the things that we were doing. So this is kind of an example of how, starting with this by, with, and through concept, we were actually able to move forward and accomplish a fairly significant military task of liberating the caliphate, really through using this by, with, and through approach. And that's why it has been my opinion, and it actually does remain my opinion even today, that this is a good model that we ought to look at. Every situation is different. If you've seen one situation, you've seen one situation. And so you have to look at it. We can't blindly apply this in other places. We have to be smart. Our people are smart, and they can help us with that. But I would just close by telling you that from my perspective, the success of this approach really came down to 3 things that were really important. First and foremost was building on the external building on the strength and the capabilities of the organization that we had and not trying to recreate them in our own image. We did not try to reach into the SDF and reorganize the Kurdish portion of it, and the Arab militias were a completely different design. Different level of leadership, a different level of capability, but we didn't try. What we tried to do was leverage what we had and try to optimize that. And I think that was a good approach in this situation. Second of all, we built very strong multi-echelon relationships at all levels. My level, to General Mazloum. Actually, there were several of us that were talking to General Mazloum throughout this, but we also had this throughout the formation. And it wasn't just military. It was Ambassador Jeffrey, Ambassador Roebuck, others. Mr. McGurk, when he was traveling in the region, were key to this, helping develop that relationship. That was important because that built trust, and that allowed us to overcome a number of very difficult periods that we had, and to move forward through those. Whether that was, hey, we're not going to. We know there's been an incursion in Afrin. We're not going to go there, and working through that, or the decision made in December as we kind of worked through that. This trust helped us with that. And then I think the final thing was the constant communication aspect of this. We talked with them all the time, and we often talked about expectations, and we tried to make it very, very clear the things that we would do, and as importantly, the things that we would not do. for them. And this was I think very, very important to, and I think we had a partner who understood that and was able to work within those constraints we have. So I think I'll close there, and I know we'll have more discussion about this. So thank you once again.
General, I wanted to follow up because I think when we talk about allies, we've talked about these different programs by, with, and through, whether it's with Afghans or Yemenis or Iraqis, but there seems to be almost much more emotional attachment here with the Kurds. And you've seen this a little bit even among congressional Republicans who criticize the president's decision, this sense of betrayal that you hear from the Kurds. Talk a little bit about what you've talked about, this multi-echelon effect from your level all the way down to the special forces, the Green Berets who are working directly with them. There seems to be a real chemistry there. If you could talk a little bit about what it's like, since you've been there, tell us what it's like on the ground. What are they doing day to day? And they form these bonds that now apparently are so hard to break, and it must be so difficult for many of your former colleagues on the ground to kind of step back and watch this happen.
Yeah, I think that is an aspect of it, and I think it is a strength of our special operations force. I think it's a strength of all of our forces, conventional or special operations. That we really do try to buy into our partners. We try to share in the danger of what is going on. I mean, as these operations are taking place, we have advisors that are in locations where they are sharing danger. They are helping them work through this. They share meals with them. They live with them. We help them with the evacuation of their casualties. When they mourn, we mourn with them. So this is really, I think, very natural human interaction that is taking place at this particular level. And so there does become a level of closeness to these partners. I think what was unique in this case, and again, as I mentioned, if you've seen one partnership, you've seen one partnership. And so you have to look at each one on its own merits here. But in this case, it was our experience, and certainly was my experience, that the Syrian Democratic Forces represented, I think, a very high-end partner here in terms of their ability to work with us, to accept the expectations and red lines that we had, and basically to put their trust in us as we pursued this campaign. I think I think you're seeing some of that play out right now, and in just some of the emotion that unfortunately does come through in this. But I think this is very natural human interaction, and our soldiers, whether they're special operations or conventional, I think feel this for their partners.
Well, you've come from the perspective of a researcher, but who recently spent a year inside the beast of the Pentagon. What lessons do you come away with? What surprised you of that? And talk about your experience as you're going forward in this larger issue.
Thank you, Eric. Friends, there are open seats in the front if you would like to take them. Okay, so you got a sense from Ken and General Votel of some of the problems we encounter in the region with our partners, but there are also a lot of challenges that we face here in Washington as far as the bureaucracy of security cooperation and how that functions or malfunctions. My view is that a major ailment of security cooperation is really internal to us. Despite all the problems that you've heard about the partners themselves, there's a lot of issues that we have to face right here in Washington to get this right. This large and exponentially growing enterprise is malfunctioning because our house is in great disorder. If foreign policy starts at home, so does security cooperation. You can have the most proficient American trainers on the ground. They can educate our partners on the best doctrine. They can hand out the best manuals. They can form the closest bonds, Kurds or otherwise. And all of that really would matter little if the bureaucracy here that is supposed to create, supervise, sustain all this is malfunctioning. And you can expect poor results, basically, if it is malfunctioning. And that's exactly what's been going on for quite some time. Now, of course, there are always exceptions. We can get lucky with a few partnerships, and I'm sure you have in mind maybe one or two that have worked relatively well, but these are not the norm. These are exceptions. I can think of the Lebanese Armed Forces as an example that I'm sure General Votel is very much familiar with. That's a success story, relatively speaking, but there are not many like that. my bottom line is this. We do not have yet a reliable and sustainable system for security cooperation here in Washington and in the US government. And I can say that differently, but it's the same thing. We do not have the proper organization and effective leadership to actually conduct this successfully. And it comes down really. Sure, my apologies. And really comes down to basics here, which is leadership and organization. Two fundamental variables that seem to be lacking in the US government with regard to security cooperation. Let me say a couple of words about each and what I really mean by each. By leadership, I specifically refer to a robust endorsement of the security cooperation reforms that Congress came up with in December of 2016, which ended up getting published in the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, in large part thanks to John McCain and his staff. But not just endorsement, but also serious, consistent supervision, oversight over the execution of those reforms. So it's one thing to actually come up with reforms, it's another altogether to actually oversee the execution of those reforms. That's what I mean by leadership, and it's been certainly lacking in that regard. Organization. If leadership is lacking, then you can expect logically that organization will also fall short, because leadership creates the bureaucracy, leadership creates the organization, organizational setup, and that has been lacking. Despite the reforms of Congress of 2016, which included many things. So one of them is, in terms of organization, is to actually create an office now in the Pentagon that is dedicated 24/7 to security cooperation. It's called the Office of Security Cooperation, where I worked. And it assigned a single official to oversee this enterprise, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, obviously working under the direction of the Undersecretary. That is certainly not enough. Okay, we have a tendency in this country to try to solve problems. We over-litigate and we over-bureaucratize. We did it consistently throughout history, specifically after 9/11. Patriot Act, Homeland Security, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as if that were enough to combat terrorism. Same thing with security cooperation. So yes, we created a new office for it. Heck, we even created a new DASD for China, as if that's really going to be sufficient to meet the priority that the general mentioned regarding competing with China and Russia. I'll give you a football analogy because it's my favorite sport. It's like a losing football team that just fired its head coach. And they hired a new coach when all along the problem has been general management, ownership, and culture. Yes, I'm looking at you, Washington Redskins. New coach is not going to cut it, okay? There's going to be massive structural changes to get this right. What are the reforms? Because those are really important. What are the gist of the reforms that Congress came up with? Because I believe that these are game changers. The most important aspect of the reforms is that we would no longer throw money and hardware at our partners and expect them all of a sudden to become better warriors and more accountable warriors. That is at least what it says on paper. We are now required by law to help them do some of the things that the general just mentioned. Institutional capacity building. Fancy word for the institutions for defense, as in the software of defense, not just the hardware. We don't do that consistently. Maybe with one or two of the partners because the conditions somehow permitted us to do that. But overall, we just don't have a record of doing that successfully for all sorts of reasons. Now we are required by law. Congress has had enough of us not doing that and having all those poor results and all those weapons ending up in the wrong hands and all that. That is as a result, at least partly, of our failure to invest in institutional capacity building. Let me sum up the organizational problems in a couple of words, the ones that we face in Washington. Too many cooks in the kitchen. Not just too many cooks in the kitchen, much worse. Those cooks are actually not talking to each other. They have different recipes. They fight over money, jurisdiction, authorities, and to keep the kitchen analogy, that's a recipe for disaster. And the biggest schism, obviously, is between the Department of Defense and the Department of State. That eternal battle over who owns what, who has the authority to do what, who has a bigger budget, who has jurisdiction over what, is an ongoing problem. And I realize it's a pipe dream to actually get those two departments to work together. It did work much better during the Cold War, but that was a long time ago. To get those two to work much more closely and to actually do joint planning on security cooperation and assistance, this is going to require leadership of both secretaries. And depending on the era, depending on the administration, sometimes it worked better than other places. But if the chemistry between the two secretaries, the working relationship between the two secretaries is not optimal, none of this is going to happen. Another organizational handicap, if you want to call it, is between this Office of Security Cooperation that I just mentioned and this fourth estate, as we call it, which is DSCA, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which is actually housed outside the Pentagon, by the way. This is a big organization, very large organization. They do tremendous work. They have now perfected the art of processing equipment releases and arms sales. But guess what? Security cooperation is not just about arms sales. I mean, this is what we're all been talking about. Security cooperation is much more than arms sales. It has to do with institutional capacity building as well. And now all of a sudden that responsibility rests in the hands of staffers at DSCA, which they've never done before. So, is this going to be a learning curve, a steep one? Absolutely. This is not going to happen overnight with DSCA. But I am of the view, this is not going to be popular with my friends at DSCA, is that this is not the place to do it. DSCA is not the place to take on the mantle of institutional capacity building. Despite all the staff that they brought over from the Institute for Security Governance based in Monterey, now they've brought in some people to DC. This is not the place for it. I don't know what is, but certainly another civilian office, whether it's in the Pentagon or joint with the State Department. In closing, and I know that Dana is going to talk about Congress, but I cannot leave without a brief comment about Congress because they've played such a leadership role in at least coming up with the reforms. I mean, that's step one, right? But what I want to say about Congress is that just like other senior leadership in the executive branch, you have to insist on accountability. It's one thing to issue the guidance, another altogether to really supervise it and make sure that all the stakeholders that are part of this enterprise are actually doing their job and what US taxpayers expect them to do. So hold more hearings, closed and open. Ask the tough questions. What is the desired end state of this security cooperation program? How much more can this partner absorb? What is its absorptive capacity? How does this program actually affect the national interest? Does it serve the US national interest? All of these questions have been asked somewhat in some ways, but certainly not consistently and without accountability. And I'm not just talking about cutting budgets or making deeper budget cuts when it comes to security cooperation. It is really consistent oversight of this issue because the American public are expecting it. This is now a new environment in Washington. I'm sure Dana has much more to say about Congress, but I'll stop here.
I'm going to, in the interest of getting to your questions more quickly, let's go right to Dana and talk about what Congress's role, and particularly the absence of real leaders in this kind of oversight. People like John McCain, who was famous for giving policymakers and commanders a thrashing up there. But Dana, please let's get your take on this.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to take a step even further back than the other speakers and talk about the general reasons when the executive branch is making the case to Congress for certain programs or certain funding. Why do we have security cooperation? So the first one, and we've been doing this for 60 years, right? So the explanations and the justifications for doing security cooperation and all of the activities and programs and colors of money that come under that umbrella, here are three that I'd like to propose. The first one is to build institutional ties and gain access. So reinforce government to government, military to military relationships that can be used both in peacetime and leveraged in wartime. So constantly when you're on the Hill and you're talking about why a program, maybe it was working before, but it's not working now, why should we continue this program? A lot of times the response is, well, who else are we going to call in a crisis? And a good example is Egypt. In 2011 and 2012, because of the extensive history of foreign military funding to the Egyptian military, those were the most developed relationships that the U.S. government had. And they were the ones that the U.S. government fell back upon when we needed to talk to people in Cairo and talk about what was going on. So touch points, connective tissue, part of all of these security cooperations, and you've heard all these different acronyms and different programs that we have, and those are only a fraction of the number of authorities and programs that we have, help us develop these institutional ties. Number two, to improve the capabilities of our partners. So this notion of interoperability in wartime so that our equipment can talk to each other, so our militaries know where in the hierarchies to coordinate within a system of alliances and partnerships. So the idea is to expand and project U.S. influence through this network. It can't just be about us. There have to be capabilities on the other side, people, military professionals, and civilians, hopefully, in the defense context, who can talk to us, understand the language we're talking, we can understand the language they're speaking, and coordinate to respond to shared crises. And three, counterterrorism and this notion of building partner capacity, which obviously expanded very much after 9/11. So the idea of improving the capabilities of partners to help conduct counterterrorism missions with us and on their own, assuming that we share the same goals. And here, the notion, and actually President Obama in the previous administration gave an entire speech about this at National Defense University, and he talked about security cooperation now provides more options in the future for partner militaries and partner forces so that we don't have to use our own military tools first. And the notion that building partner capacity so that we have capable and effective partners abroad is cost effective for the American taxpayer. So these are some of the debates and discussions that take place on Capitol Hill. Over the past several years specifically, the system of authorities and programs and funding sources has exponentially expanded. And so this is what Bilal talked about. I want to talk about two core tensions in how Congress conducts oversight or attempts to conduct oversight of our security cooperation and building partnership capacity programs. So the first one is State Department versus Defense Department, and Bilal also just touched on this. So Congress is interested in authorities and money, right? It both authorizes programs and activities, and it provides the appropriations for those programs and activities. State Department, over time, its tools and funding for these programs and activities has remained rather static. The pool of money, the number of programs is not expanding, and those tools are rather inflexible because of the 2-year fiscal planning cycle. So now State Department is talking about how it's going to fund things 2 or 3 years in advance. Does anyone know what the world is going to look like 2 or 3 years from now and what contingencies we may need to respond to? Right. So examples of State Department funding, which you all probably have heard, FMF, foreign military funding. Most of FMF, the entire pie of FMF, goes to 4 recipients: Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. That leaves a very small slice of the pie for the rest of the world. And because that pool of FMF is not expanding, usually we turn to DoD, who has all sorts of additional funds, and every year Congress gives it a contingency operating fund, and DoD has much more flexible authorities to respond to these crises, especially because the pool of State Department funding is not expanding. Bilal also talked about foreign military sales and commercial sales. These come under the State Department, but again, the authority and the legislation litigating these sorts of programs hasn't been updated in years. And finally, another one that I just want to touch upon is international military education and training, IMET. This is where we actually pay to bring foreign officers into American military colleges, which is a great program. But again, the pool of money for these kinds of programs is not expanding on the State Department side. In contrast, DoD's budget has grown, especially, as I said, for contingencies. But there was an expanding patchwork of new authorities, a special program every time there was a new crisis somewhere in the world. And this led to the FY17 National Defense Authorization Act reforms that Bilal was talking about. It was an attempt to take about, based on your definition of what a program is, 80 to 100 different security cooperation programs, all under the Department of Defense Authority, attempt to streamline them, standardize metrics for effectiveness and evaluation, transparency and oversight, and bring some harmony to the kinds of funding and how we measure the fiscal year to fiscal year, which countries and which programs are receiving what funding to accomplish what. So I want to give you an example of how this works in real life. When you're on the Hill and either the State Department or the Defense Department wants to secure funding or approval for a specific program, they send up a proposal to the Hill called a Congressional Notification, or CN. So if you're on a committee that has oversight over the State Department, you may have some questions about it. And if it's something that's using State Department funding, or it's for the international military education, or it's a foreign military sale, that goes to either the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the House Foreign Affairs Committee. That means it doesn't go to the Armed Services Committees on the Senate or the House side, who, as I said, have a much larger budget and much bigger programs and are much more flexible in how they can spend that money. So if it's funding under the NDAA that Bilal talked about, or any of these other programs, then those congressional notifications go to the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee, which means on any given day that if you're a staffer looking at what the State Department is doing, you don't see at all what's happening on the Armed Services side. And if you're on the Armed Services side, you actually have no idea what's happening in terms of foreign military sales, because that's totally on the State Department side and the congressional committees that have oversight of that. Not only that, money. So for reports about how specific money is sent, that's sent to appropriations committees, which is not the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Relations Committee. So if you're a staffer who wants to decide, should I approve and recommend that my boss approve this congressional notification, I would like a bird's eye view of exactly how this program fits into everything we're doing with this partner military or this government or this country. There is no answer, because DoD is not required to track these programs or how it spends its money or how it evaluates its programs the same way the State Department is doing, and different committees on any given day are getting different reports. And finally, what's the point of all of this? Isn't it to tie what we're doing at the military, security cooperation, or defense level to a broader strategic effect or policy outcome? Who has responsibility over that? Well, it's really great that DoD got this broad reorganization of how it does things under the FY17 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. That's also because DoD every year is a must-pass piece of legislation. Every year, no matter what, Congress is going to pass that National Defense Authorization Act. Does anyone know the last time there was an Authorization Act passed for the State Department?
61.
Actually, there was a little one in like 93, 94. But the point is 93, 94. What were you guys doing in 93, 94? So this is a challenge, and some of this is about the Hill. So if we want to force the State Department and Defense Department to do joint planning, then we're going to have to work together as congressional committees and members of Congress to come together with an authorization and that actually directs the State Department to do this and directs the Defense Department to pay attention to the State Department. And right now, it's highly personality dependent and program dependent. So if you have a fabulous commander of CENTCOM who really wants to develop relationships with U.S. ambassadors, then maybe you get that joint planning. But again, personality dependent and program dependent, not because there's legislation or because it's institutionalized that this joint planning has to take place. I'm just going to spend the rest of my comments talking about executive versus legislative tension, which also affects how Congress conducts oversight. So at its core, in my view, Congress sees security cooperation and building partnership capacity as an area of leverage, and that should be leveraged to affect behavioral change. In general, often, on the executive branch side, when advocating for a specific program under the security cooperation or building partner capacity umbrella, the sense is that the relationships gained or the specific on-the-ground near-term objectives are ends into themselves and not necessarily tied into a broader strategic objective or something that can be leveraged, i.e. taken away if you don't see the desired behavioral change. So 2 questions here, or 2 issues. 1, the by, with, and through model, I would argue, is actually working in many contexts in the sense that we now have plenty of partners in the Middle East who buy U.S. equipment, use U.S. equipment, and apply U.S. military training to address their own security challenges. What you are now hearing from Capitol Hill is they don't like the way in which our partners are addressing their own security challenges. A good example is Saudi Arabia and Yemen in a coalition that they formed with a military plan to execute in Yemen. regardless of views on what is taking place in Yemen, at its core, this is actual security cooperation working. We have partners using our equipment and our training to do something that they perceive to be a security challenge to them with very minimal help from us. Another example is UAE and Egypt and Libya, same thing. Security challenges that they perceive in Libya that we're not addressing, they're taking our equipment and our training, and they're actually attempting to train others in Libya to address a challenge so that they don't have to be there in large forces themselves. So now the debate on Capitol Hill, to my view, has migrated to should we be doing security cooperation and how do we do security cooperation? Because U.S. origin equipment and training is being used in ways that are actually more destabilizing to the region. And that is the core of the debate that we have to move forward. Some of it can be addressed, as Bilal has talked about, if we were to institutionalize this broader notion of tying what we're doing at the security cooperation and tactical and operational level to a strategic effect. And secondly, how does building partnership capacity in the short term tie to this long-term strategic goals of the United States? And this is where issues come up every single day in how Congress is conducting oversight of these programs. For example, is our training, the people that we've trained or the equipment that we've sold or transferred being used to violate human rights, to suppress internal repression or civil society, civilian casualties, civilian protection issues? Is it skewing the balance of power away from civilian and civilian-led institutions in certain countries? How do you evaluate the effectiveness of these issues, and how transparent are those recipients of our aid and training? So a great example is end-use monitoring. We're not in Yemen, so we don't know how our equipment is being used, and it's very hard to have frank conversations with our partners about exactly how they're using our equipment. Transparency is you want to know where our equipment is being stored. Is our sensitive defense technology being protected? In what depot? Where? How many? Who has access to that depot other than us and our partner recipient country? These are challenges that we're still working through today, and often when the executive branch is coming to talk to congressional staff or members of Congress, they don't have good answers to these issues, which slows down the process. Because these programs are so large compared to what we're doing on the civilian side, you constantly see Congress attempting to condition these to mitigate or moderate. Maybe we'll sell defensive weapons to a certain country, but we're not going to sell offensive weapons. We'll give you this amount of money as a grant, but we're going to put conditions on it and make the State Department grade your homework, and are you doing X, Y, and Z? All of these things at the end just undermine the original intent of these programs because we haven't found better ways of engaging with our partners. So I'm going to leave it there for now and turn it back over to Eric. Thank you.
Great. We've just got a few minutes left for questions from the audience. So if I could, if you'd identify yourself and make sure there's a question mark at the end of your questions, and we'll try and get as many in as we can here in just the last 5 minutes or so. Michael? Oh, we have till 2? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought we've got lots of time. Sorry.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal for General Votel. Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal for General Votel. You've identified some things that a by, with, and through strategy needs and can benefit from advisors who accompany the forces, training, air support. But it also requires trust between the two partners. And while maybe there's not a specific political commitment about what might occur at the end of the rainbow, some sense that the United States is a reliable partner. There have now been 2 occasions in which the U.S. has blindsided the SDF. December 2018, when President Trump said we were getting out, and recently when he said we were pulling forces back from the safe zone without any warning, glide path, anything of the kind. My question is, can the relationship with the SDF, has it been permanently injured? Can it be sustained? And what would it take at this juncture, given everything that's transpired, to make this an effective by, with, and through relationship going forward?
Well, thanks. I think that's an excellent question. I mean, it would seem that at this particular point that we made it very, very hard for them to have a partnership relationship with us, because of this recent policy decision. And so I think this is certainly put a lot of tension into this. Whether it is irretrievably broken or not, I don't know. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in my view, have demonstrated themselves to be very resilient in this. We thought in December, I thought in December that this was a breaking point for us. It wasn't. We managed to get through this. I thought when there was posturing and rhetoric related to earlier Turkish intentions to come across the border, I thought that this would be a breaking point. I thought when there was an incursion into Afrin, I thought that this would be a breaking point, and they weren't. So, I think one of the things we learn on this is our partners are very resilient. They don't have many options. Maybe that makes them more resilient, that they continue to do this. I do know that, that from my own experience there, that they felt very strongly. They had options. It was very common knowledge that that the Syrian Democratic Force leadership talked to everybody in the country, whether it was regime, the Russians, the Iranians, and us. And so they have options, but yet, despite all of that, they kept coming back to us. I don't know if it is more, if it's irretrievably broken or not. It does not look like it's moving in the right direction at this point, from my perspective. I think where that, I think where that leaves them, I think, is with some very difficult choices moving forward here, in terms of how they try to resolve this situation.
My question was, is there anything the U.S. should do?
Well, I mean, I think I think the president was very, very clear in terms of that we did not support this Turkish operation in here, and so perhaps the United States and other countries of the world should speak very, very directly about this and about their concern with this. As we tried to touch on in our article here, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in a way, provided a service to many countries in the world by their sacrifice on the battlefield, and by the fact that they have secured fighters and they have safeguarded their family members for a long period of time. And while there may be some assistance is getting through that, they are bearing the responsibility for this for the world. So I am well aware of the interests here and Turkey's legitimate concerns about their own security, but I think perhaps what could be done is the international community speaking more directly about their concerns on this and trying to limit what is being done and try to get to another level where this could actually be discussed or addressed in another way other than through military operations.
Bilal, you wanted to make a comment on earlier?
Just very quickly,
description.
just so there's no confusion over what we all mean by capability and capacity. I think the distinction is quite important, and it lies at the very heart of this whole discussion, right? Capability is the ability to shoot straight, right? And we've had some successes, as Ken has mentioned, with the CTS, with the Iraqis, whether it's with the Kurds or the Lebanese armed forces. Capacity is actually the ability to do that on a consistent basis, right? So the way you test that is if you pull the plug on support, U.S. support, whether they can actually do this on their own. And the answer to that, unfortunately, is that most of them, if not all of them, cannot do this on their own. That's the challenge that we all face here. They have to graduate at some point from U.S. support. And this is what I think we're all been trying to discuss here on this panel.
Mm-hmm. Questions over here? Yes, sir. Right here.
Hi, my name's Geduld Özcan and I represent the People's Democratic Party, the HDP, here in the US. And my question is again to General Votel. The Syria Study Group just issued a report in which one of their main recommendations was that in order to continue working with the SDF and also sustain the strategic alliance with Turkey, the US needed to invest more in trying to bring the PKK and the Turkish government back to the negotiating table. Because we know that when this was happening between 2013 and 2015, the Turkish government was meeting Syrian Kurdish officials in Ankara. A joint YPG Turkish army operation moved the Süleyman Şah tomb from one place to another. And so my question is, could and should the US work harder to try and bring the PKK and the Turkish government back to the negotiating table. Over the summer, we just had an opinion piece by Cemil Bayrak, one of the leaders of the PKK, in the Washington Post, in which he says that his movement is ready for this.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the answer is yes. I mean, and it shouldn't just be the United States. It should be other countries in the world that should be trying to help with this as well. It's in not just in our interest, but it's in the interest of many countries here to try to resolve some of these longstanding tensions and try to bring some level of stability into this. And so I think there are mechanisms out there that could be used, whether it is going through some of the Iraqi groups that share a good relationship with Turkey, and using that as a mechanism. I think it's always better if we are talking and we're getting to that. And so I think yes. I think the United States. But I think others should be part of this as well. This is in the interests of many of more than just the United States for this issue to be resolved.
In the back, please.
Yes, hi, thank you. Joyce Karam with The National. My question is about the operation itself. How long do you see it going? And we know, James Jeffrey said it's a bad idea, but why is it a bad idea? I mean, do you see casualties? Do you see this being a quagmire, perhaps, for Turkey?
Okay. Well, first up. So I don't know. I don't have any other independent source of information to tell me how the campaign is going and how it's proceeding. I think time will tell with this. I don't have any unique insights into that. I'm seeing probably the same reporting that we're all seeing. I think the same reporting that everybody is. It's coming through the various media channels and other things that are out there. So I don't know if we know exactly how this can play out. To your other question, I think. My response is this: is that this area was relatively stable, and so interjecting now this level of conflict into it, I think, risks that stability. And I don't know that contributes to the overall objective that is going on here. There are a variety of things that we have attempted to do, and working with our Turkish allies here to try to resolve that. Many of you are familiar with kind of this discussion of the so-called safe zone or security mechanisms, as I kind of refer to them, which are designed to try to address the different interests in the area. I mean, this is a pretty complex problem here. I mean, Turkey has very legitimate interests here about securing their own border and keeping their people safe. At the same time, the peoples of northeast Syria have very legitimate interests in terms of being stable and being safe in their homes and being able to move forward with their lives. And the U.S. and the U.S.-led coalition have very valid interests in terms of making sure that an organization like ISIS can't resurge. Now, what we're trying to do with things like the security mechanism is look at how we can best address all of those interests and create the very best situation we can, and likely that is going to require compromise. No one is going to be completely 100% satisfied with the answer, but when you have these different interests, I'm not necessarily to say they're competing, but they're different interests here that are represented. It makes it very, very difficult to do that. And so I think what you have to do is you have to try to pursue things like security mechanisms. You have this idea of joint operations centers, of patrols, of surveillance, of getting some of the Kurdish YPG fighters and positions off the border, eliminating some of that. I mean, that's what that was all designed to do, and in the end, that was not enough for the government of Turkey. So I mean, this is a very, 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 very difficult situation here. So.
I think Ken and Dana both wanted to comment on the question, so please go ahead.
So I think the bigger question here is whether or not Turkish operations actually set the conditions for the next cycle of conflict. So there's a lot of questions here that no entity, Turkey, nor the United States, nor the SDF can answer at this point in time. ISIS. So it's not just about whether or not ISIS gains the space to resurge in northern Syria. It's what happens to all of the pop-up detention centers, all across Syria or northeastern Syria and down that are not right in the area that Turkey's identified as its near-term security objective, but which the SDF are likely not going to have the capacity to continue to maintain custody over as they shift north. Another one is refugees. If Turkey, as President Erdogan has discussed, moves all of these refugees from inside Turkey into this area that is not ethnically or from a sectarian perspective their home, what happens to all of those communities, property, all sorts of implications there? And third, I highly doubt that Assad and Damascus, Russia and Iran are just going to sit out on the sidelines while this goes on and we all take a step back. So what happens there and what are the implications of that? And I would just say, looking at Assad, Russia and Iran operations in other parts of Syria, namely Idlib, we sort of know what it looks like, and it's pretty ugly. And it leads to many, many more civilian casualties, which then create the next cycle of violence. And we know that ISIS thrives in that violence.
I'll just pick up on Dana's point because Dana's point because she's absolutely right. You know, when you look at these civil wars historically, these kinds of limited interventions, and safe zones in particular, but these kinds of limited interventions don't work, right? They very, very, very rarely produce a positive outcome for the country trying it, right? I mean, you know, the Israelis, magnificent military. How many times did they intervene in Lebanon to try to accomplish similar objectives, right? It doesn't work. What you find over and over and over again is it sucks them into the conflict. And, you know, Turkey has far greater political and economic issues than Israel did. Israel's a very strong state and was able to withstand the negative externalities of its interventions in Lebanon. It's not at all clear that Turkey under Erdogan at this moment has anything like the same resilience. And so whatever their rationale in the short term, and I agree with General Votel, I can understand why from their perspective they feel the need to do this. But again, when you take a historical perspective on civil wars, we've seen this movie so many different times. The actors change, the ending doesn't.
Yes.
Hi, Renda Slim, Middle East Institute. This is addressed to Dana. So the Syrian Study Group came up with all these recommendations for what the U.S. should do in terms of the Syrian conflict going forward. How does this Turkish operation change, basically, all these recommendations? And what do you recommend should be the priorities of the United States government going forward in terms of conflict management in Syria?
So unfortunately, it looks like what's happening now means the Syria Study Group recommendations were pretty quickly thrown in the trash. But what we specifically said is that working bilaterally with Turkey and then the U.S. acting as a mediator and confidence builder to work with the SDF to take steps that would address legitimate Turkish security concerns was working at this point in time and forestalling the risks of a Turkish incursion, which the consensus of the group was a Turkish incursion into northern Syria at this point in time would give ISIS the opportunity to completely reconstitute. We already know that even though it's been pushed out of its land from a territorial perspective, it's transitioned to an insurgency, continuing to threaten local communities, and that those communities needed time to rebuild. And with this operation, the SDF would be focused to turn north on protecting their families and communities, which means that we don't have our capable local partner on the ground keeping up pressure on ISIS. And at the same time, the group argued that the U.S. military through the SDF in 1/3 of Syria was tremendous U.S. leverage to affect the ultimate outcome of the underlying causes of the Syrian conflict through a political process, because there is no military solution here. So just a few weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, there was an announcement of a breakthrough, too soon to tell whether or not it's going to work, but the formation of a constitutional committee under the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 talking about what the end of the Syrian conflict would look like. And it was diplomacy and mediation. And if you have all the stakeholders in the conflict arguing at the table rather than battling out on the ground, I would argue that is a good thing, both for Syrian civilians, for the region, and for U.S. national security interests. That 1/3 of Syria that the U.S. controlled via the SDF was tremendous leverage. And now we don't have it. And we have most likely undermine whatever credibility we had left, which the Syria study group found as we traveled the region was already severely damaged from the December 2018 announcement about the U.S. drawing down its forces.
Yes, Harlan.
I'm Harlan Ullman with a number of institutions in town. First, I'd like to thank the panel for a very somber but very accurate, I think, assessment. And so I'm going to give you a chance to become even more somber. Our strategy calls for a global competition with Russia and China. And I'd like you evaluate as to what we're doing in terms of that global competition in the region. Putin seems to be everywhere. He's in Saudi Arabia now, sold S-400s to Turkey. While the Chinese do not have a military component, the Chinese are also everywhere with deals in Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you grade America's strategic competition with Russia and China in the region right now?
Ken, you want to start off?
Go ahead there, Ken.
Thanks, Harlan. Yeah, I'd give us about like an F, maybe an F. Is there an F plus? Can you give an F plus? We're not, right? And to me, it's kind of striking. And first, at one level, I just think back to 2010, right? In the Middle East, nobody talked about Russia in 2010. Russia wasn't a player in the Middle East. We've let them back in. They're now a major player in the Middle East all over the place. Right? And let's think a little bit about what's been going on right now in the Gulf, where the United States is, as fast as we can, backtracking from our commitments to allies that go back 45, 40 years, 75 years, depending on when you want to date things. President Trump has announced that the Iranians can attack the GCC states all the Iranians like, as long as they don't attack us. Right? That's a fundamental betrayal of our informal alliance with the GCC states, a fundamental betrayal of the Carter Doctrine and what I would call the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine. Right? Completely upended things. It's terrifying them. They are going looking for alternatives. I think that they know that the Russians and Chinese aren't perfect alternatives to us, but they need somebody, right? And if we're not going to be it, they will look for help wherever they can. Again, I'm old enough, I know you're old enough too, to remember in 1987, right, when the Kuwaitis came to us and asked us if we'd like to escort their ships. And the initial response of the Reagan administration was, no, we really don't want to fight the Iranians. And so what did the Kuwaitis do? They went and asked the Russians. And the Russians said yes before the Kuwaitis could finish the sentence. We're going to put our fleet into the Persian Gulf, the beating heart of the Western economy. Sign us up. How do we get there? And then all of a sudden, the Reagan administration realized maybe that wasn't such a great idea. And okay, maybe we do need to take on the Iranians, right? We're throwing that right out the window.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your time. Rahim Rashidi or Mr. Kurd from Kurdistan. General, how would you like to describe U.S. policy about the Kurds? And in your opinion, in your view, which kind of the benefit pushed the president to make this terrible decision to turn on green light for Erdogan to attack very safe area in Syria and Rojava? Thank you.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we've got an issue with our overall consistency here in terms of how we're approaching the Kurds and particularly our partners in Syria here, and we certainly have been trying to approach this in a very direct manner and emphasizing partnership at the tactical and operational level. But I think the key piece here is perhaps we didn't have full alignment all the way up and down the chain, and I think that is very, very critical to this. With the decisions that the president has made, the policy shift that has been put in place, I think that's come front and center here. So, I don't think there's any other way of describing it other as inconsistent, incomplete, conflicted here in terms of that. I think it certainly certainly some challenges with that.
Yes, sir.
Dave Ottaway from the Wilson Center. What lessons should we draw from the fact that Iran was able to attack the Saudi facilities and mass 25 drones and cruise missiles? What lessons should we draw about the protection of Saudi Arabia, of U.S. ability to even protect its own ships and assets in the Gulf, given Iran's proven ability to carry out an incredible stealth attack?
Well, I think I think there are several lessons here learned. I think first and foremost is the technology learning curve is turning much faster now. When you look at I just in my own, I won't take you through a lengthy discussion of this, but I just look at my own in our own development of unmanned aerial vehicles and how that's developed over the last 18 years, essentially from 2001 till the current time. And what we see is the Iranians with their proxies, the Houthis or whoever it happens to be, turning that curve much faster and learning much faster and taking advantage of kind of the platform, the base of technology that has been out there and the learning that's already done and turning that much quicker. And so they have a capability. That's, I think, a very key thing for us to understand. That changes the dynamic in the region in terms of our ability to protect ourselves or our partners to protect themselves or their critical infrastructure. Certainly we've seen not just an increase in quantity, but certainly in quality of Iranian missile systems and air defense systems over the last number of years, and this has changed some of the fundamental assumptions about how we would operate in this area. Our ability to just steam into the Arabian Gulf and conduct operations is that would be a false assumption at this particular point. And so, technology and these capabilities that Iran has developed, I think, has changed the equation for us, and they become, again, I don't know, there hasn't been a public accounting for exactly what happened here in terms of that. And again, I don't have any particularly unique insights into that. But it certainly highlights that there's a level of savviness here, and in terms of how they are employing this, and that they are studying and they're taking their time and they're looking for ways to do this. I think it raises the stakes in the region. It highlights the role that technology is having in this, and I think it also highlights that Iran continues to push for red lines and trying to push up against those to find out what they can get away with, and trying to understand what it is that kind of brings us to the next level here. So, I think there's a variety of lessons that we can take out of that.
If I can jump in, Dave, I think there are two issues I'd like to add on to what General Votel said, which I think is exactly right. The first one is these technologies are very difficult to protect against. Right? My guess is that we would have a very hard time coping with them. Yes, there's the issue of a lot of the Saudi assets were focused toward the south, but the truth of the matter is where, exactly as General Votel was saying, where UAV technology is going, where drones are going, is going in a direction that's very, very difficult for contemporary, current day air defenses to deal with. These things are very small. They fly slow. They fly very low to the ground. They can, follow terrain. They're very precise. It's actually why, I think a related point. 4 years ago, I was saying to people, we were having the debates over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and I was saying we are making way too much of the ballistic missiles because the UAVs are quickly surpassing the ballistic missiles in terms of the actual dangers that they're creating, and we shouldn't get obsessed with the fact that the ballistic missiles are not in the JCPOA. That's not really the issue. So point number one is these things are very, very difficult to deal with. Second, related point, and again, it pivots off of something that General Votel said. The truth is our defense of the Gulf was never predicated on pure defense. It never has been. With the possible exception of the 6 months between August 1990 and February 1991, the United States has never had the military forces in the Gulf to stop any Iranian attack. You know this well from your own work on Saudi, right? The truth of the matter is the Gulf oil infrastructure is so enormous. The Gulf is so big, the Iranians could always sneak stuff past us. The real deterrent came from the expectation of American retaliation, of an American response. And what really happened, and the key thing to take away, was the Iranians did the Abqaiq attack because they saw the non-responses in June and July. And they came away and they clearly calculated that if they maintained plausible deniability, that there was little likelihood that the U.S. would respond this time. And so they did an even bigger attack. They escalated. And we've just done the exact same thing. And my guess is that the hardliners who are now running the government in Tehran are looking at that and saying, we're telling you, these guys are a paper tiger. They're not going to respond. And if we're not going to respond, then we're not defending the Gulf.
Precisely right. I mean, that's exactly my point, which is the opportunity to now rethink the deterrence architecture in the Middle East, right? This is the strategic lesson now of this entire episode. The reason why we have such immense firepower is precisely to deter the kind of attack that we witnessed a couple of weeks ago. And since we failed, certainly this is now ample time to rethink that. And it's not just about how many forces do you have or how much equipment you have. It's also about intentions. It's also about policy. All of that is related.
Come over here for this.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Farouk. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment. I have two quick questions that touch directly upon the points that you raised. First of all, on Russia and China, I heard at least two former or current US officials, when they were asked the same question, they replied saying, oh, well, be my guest, go ahead, be my guest and go ahead, try Russia and China. They will never give the security cooperation and the kind of institution building that the US is giving. So how do you assess that? What scope Russia and China, you or the general, can be a viable alternative to the security cooperation that the US gives to GCC countries? And the second question is related to the first one. Do they have the kind of systems that are more adapted to these new threats, the new UAV attacks on the Gulf?
Excuse me. So I guess my comment to the first part of your question is that voids will be filled. And where we pull back, where we choose not to partner with somebody, where we choose not to provide capabilities, then we should expect that they will seek that from other people. And that's if we're willing to accept that risk, then we're willing to accept that risk. But I think that's the case. I don't think I think my experience, my observation of the region is where we have pulled back from people in terms of this, where we have made it difficult to get systems to them. They have tried to fill those voids.
Security cooperation, I know that CENTCOM is culturally predisposed to using the tool to gain access, overflight, and basing, but security cooperation is about a lot of those things. And so it's not just about, the equipment that they will get from the Russians and the Chinese. It's us ceding all those things to the Russians and the Chinese. And then it becomes a question to us, can we actually afford doing that in places like the Eastern Med, in the Levant, or in the Gulf? If you are to effectively prosecute the global power competition, which is the new marching orders in the Pentagon. So it's not just about those equipment, it's also the relationships, the access, and the overflight and the basing. Because if we, exactly what the general said, step out, they'll do the exact same things.
I just want to add as well. So there's the perception issue, and then there's the actual implementation or the systems around it. So for security cooperation, and to be clear, I'm not advocating that we change all these things overnight, but our system for security cooperation is very complicated. So Ken first talked about we have to recognize what our partners want from us and not seek to superimpose our system on them, right? Well, part of it is that a China or a Russia doesn't try to change the hierarchy of partner militaries, et cetera. Human rights, conditionality. Well, first of all, Russia and China don't have parliaments. They don't have anything like our Congress who seeks to exert oversight. There is no human rights. There is no conditionality. There is no congressional requirement for qualitative military edge, QME, to make sure that whatever you're selling or training to others in the region is balanced against Israel and Israel's security. There's no concern from Russia and China like we have about oversight to avoid corruption and graft, who's paying off whom with those systems, et cetera. How you use the systems, Russia and China also don't care. So I think that when we think about our competitive advantage, there's a whole system that we've created that sometimes make us less competitive. And that is something that we have to balance. But I will say for the Syria Study Group, having traveled throughout the region, what is fascinating is how so many in the region believe that the path to peace or what they want goes through Moscow. And then you have a conversation about exactly what has Moscow committed to you that they have delivered upon. And it's always a blank stare. There's nothing there. But the perception game, even if U.S. military equipment is the best, even if our military colleges, war colleges, are the best and people still want to come here, even if our training is the best, right? Even if our access to international financial institutions and international organizations that assist other militaries is the best, the perception game right now is certainly that you're better off looking to Moscow or Beijing.
Let me just add one more point to that. I think my panelists have made a lot of really good points, but there's one more that I think that does need to be on the table, which is the reason, look, I have many friends in the Persian Gulf, like going there, at least parts of it. But I'm not wedded to it as an American, right? If someone else could be in the Persian Gulf and be ensuring a stable oil market, that'd be fine. We don't have to do it. The problem is this. The Russians are not interested in what we're interested with the oil market. They want a high price of oil. And by the way, I should have made this point to begin with. We've fallen in love with shale, right? We think shale is the solution to everything. And in the short term, and in a very kind of fifth grade understanding of energy economics, yeah, we don't import our oil from the Gulf. But truth be told, we never really did, much less than we ever did. It was always about the entire international economy's reliance on oil and the Persian Gulf's contribution to that. Right now, 25% of the oil consumed in the world comes from the Gulf. Okay, if you want to have a look, go look at the new U.S. Energy Information Administration forecast. Their expectation is that by 2050, the Gulf is going to go from 25% to 31%. Okay, and they expect our production to peak in the next decade or so and decline after that. Okay? We're not getting less dependent on Gulf oil, we're getting more. And by the way, the total consumption of oil is expected to go from 100 million barrels per day to 127 million barrels per day. Right? So this idea that we don't really need to worry that the world is going to be less dependent on the Persian Gulf is absolutely wrong. Okay? As I said, the Russians, they're not interested in having a stable oil market. They want the price to go up, right? And what we've seen is exactly as Anne said, they couldn't care less about the internal affairs of these countries, which we have learned is actually the biggest threat to oil production, right? And they're perfectly glad to help their allies kill each other, kill their own people, etc. That also doesn't breed greater stability. The Chinese theoretically could take on our role. My hope is someday they will, because they do have the same interests that we have in the Gulf. The problem is they don't act like it, right? They don't understand what I just said to you. The way that they interact with the states of the Middle East often is very pernicious in exactly the ways that Dana was describing. They do not yet understand the importance and how to do it, all that. All of that means that we remain irreplaceable, at least for now. And the last point, what if we just walk away and nobody's there? First, the General's absolutely right. Somebody's going to fill the vacuum. I actually think that if it's not the Russians and Chinese, and they will try, it'll be the Iranians. But all you have to do is look around the region. When we pull back, it terrifies our allies. Right? This moral hazard argument, which has been around for at least a decade, has been disproven again and again and again in the Middle East. Our allies do not look into the abyss and say, oh, well, we now have to negotiate, we have to come back to the table, be peaceful. They attack each other. Right? We see it over and over and over again. We're seeing it happen now. Right? Our role in the region has been to introduce stability by making it difficult for our adversaries to attack our allies and reassuring our allies that they don't have to fend for themselves, because when they do, they lash out. Right? That is the role that we play, and we are doomed to play it for some time to come.
We've come to an end of the session here. I want to thank you all for your questions, and please join me in thanking the panelists here for this presentation. Thank you.